In this section, I'm going to talk to you about Ansible and errors, particularly how to try to deal with, understand, and debug, troubleshoot errors that you see with Ansible playbooks. So now a few sort of overview rules. So the first rule is try to read and understand the error message that Ansible spits out to you. In the majority of cases, it's going to give you a pointer on where you need to look. So really look at what it's saying and try to understand it. Some additional things to follow. So try to simplify your playbook, especially with SSH connection issues. Simplify your playbook to a simple base case. So if you're using the Ansible core modules, just use a playbook with iOS facts and a provider. Make sure it works. I would start standardizing your providers. So get a standard provider for the various Ansible core modules. You might have one for SSH and one for an API for given platforms. Get a standardized provider for Napalm. If you start using some library called NTC Ansible, use a standardized provider for it. It'll save you from having to basically resolve this problem of what does my provider look like for these given modules. Some other things to be aware of. So Ansible core modules are going to have pretty obscure troubleshooting messages for SSH connection issues. That's going to be true in Ansible 2.3, and it looks like it's probably going to be true in Ansible 2.4. Ansible 2.4 is probably going to come out in something like September, October of 2017. Hopefully in the future that will be improved, but right now there are pretty obscure messages, and we'll look at some examples of that. You also need to be aware of formatting and in spacing. You should hopefully know by now that spacing matters in YAML, and it can be very particular. So make sure you look at your playbook structure. You're going to have various levels of indentation. You have indentation at the play level, and then you also have indentation at the tasks level, and then you have for a given module, a given task that you're doing, you're going to have arguments for that module. So be aware of your indentation levels. Once again, this can be a case where simplifying your problem once you start getting an error is going to help you. You also have this issue of where Ansible looks for modules. Ansible has something known as a module path. That's where it looks for modules, and there's various ways you can control where Ansible looks for modules. So the Ansible core modules, Ansible is going to know how to find. But for things like Napalm Ansible and things like NTC Ansible and other custom modules, they may not be included with Ansible Core. You're going to need to install those, and you're going to need to specify where Ansible can find them. Now, let's start looking at doing a clean install of Ansible here. So I'm on a lab server. I just logged out of a virtual environment. I'm going to make a new virtual environment. So I'm going to actually go move Ansible test. Just going to move this directory to that. I'm going to make a virtual environment. I'm going to use Python 2.7. I would still recommend using Python 2.7 with Ansible, at least as of 2.3 and probably Ansible 2.4. Their Python 3 support is still not fully, it doesn't look like it's fully supported, fully tested, so I would give it more time before I tried to use Python 3 with Ansible. Okay, so I'm going to build this virtual environment. I'm going to give it a name, Ansible test. I'm going to use Python 2.7. So this is basically creating a clean sandbox where that I can install a new version of Ansible into. I log in to that virtual environment using this source, the name of my virtual environment, bin activate. Now if I go and look at what I have installed, you'll basically see I have nothing installed. Pip and setup tools, which are two very low-level libraries in Python. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to upgrade my pip, and it actually gives me instructions on how to do that. Rerun my pip list, gives me a deprecation warning, but I can now see I have an updated version of pip. Now, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and want to install Ansible. So if I type which Ansible, I see I don't have any Ansible. I go ahead and install Ansible. And you can see here it's installing Ansible 232. And we'll wait for that to complete. And then at the end of this, I'm going to show you that we are in fact running Ansible 232. So we can do version. We now have Ansible 232 installed. And you can also see where it's pointing to for that Ansible. Now, we have Ansible installed. Now you need to make sure you point to the correct version of Python in your Ansible inventory. So I'm going to go ahead and update my Ansible hosts. I'm going to point to the version of Python that I want to use, which is this one in this new virtual environment that I just created. Okay, so now hopefully we should be using this new version of Ansible with this version of Python that I specified. So now let's go look at some failure use cases. So at this point, I have Ansible installed. There's a few other groundwork things I would need to do to get everything up and working. One of those is to configure the Ansible host path. This used to have a different variable name. It used to be called, I think, host file. It's either host file or host files, something on that order. It has now been updated to inventory, and the old keyword has been deprecated. It looks like as of Ansible 2.4, you actually need to use this new format. So here I'm specifying where to look for my inventory. Here I'm specifying some additional libraries that I want to be able to use for my Ansible module path. This is where Ansible is going to look for modules. I had to separately install both Napalm Ansible and NTC Ansible using either pip or a git clone command. But I had to have those installed so that those libraries exist in these paths. And then there's a few other arguments that I have here. This retry file's enabled. I'm just specifying I don't want it to generate retry files. I'm not using those, so I don't want those to be generated. A couple other arguments. This one basically says don't do the host key checking. You remember how we were getting errors for SSH known hosts? This is saying don't check the SSH signature that comes back to you. Now this is a security issue. You're vulnerable to potential security attacks here, so you have to understand whether this is appropriate in your environment to do this or not. I probably would not do this in a production environment. I certainly wouldn't do this in an environment where the security was somewhat high. And then this last argument is saying record host keys equals true, which is going to automatically add the SSH host keys into known hosts for you. Now, there's nuance in this, in that there's some issues doing this when you have Ansible connection set to local. So there's some nuance to this record host keys true. So this is our .ansible.config file. This is specifying additional parameters for how we want Ansible to operate. The two big ones being we want our inventory file to be installed in our home directory Ansible hosts, and we're modifying our Ansible module path. Now the other big thing you have to set up is your Ansible inventory file. And we've talked quite a bit about Ansible inventory earlier in the course. So at this point, I should have Ansible up and working with a couple of caveats of I had to install Napalm Ansible and I had to install NTC Ansible. And for both of these, there might be some additional libraries I need to install in my virtual environment. And basically, there's ways you can get those so that they're fully installed properly and all the dependencies are included. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at our first error case. So here I have a playbook. Pretty simple playbook. I'm going to do iOS facts. I have some provider specified. I have some tags stated. And then I'm going to use the debug statement to print out one of those facts. Let's go ahead and execute this playbook and see what we get. Now, here we see the message. Now, since I'm operating on the Cisco group, there's output for 2 devices. Now, one ugly aspect of Ansible error messages is it prints it out in JSON. So here you see curly brace, that's getting printed out in JSON. One trick for how to better display that is to go into Python and print it out as a string. So it might give us some more clues, and it's certainly going to be easier to read. So now when we look at this message, we have to look at what it's telling us. And we go up here, and I look at the very top here, and I see this statement. The field args has an invalid value which appears to include a variable that is undefined. The error was creds is undefined. So this comes back to that very first point. Read the error message. Make sure you look at what it's complaining about. So this is telling me that Ansible doesn't know about this creds variable. Where would we expect to find the creds variable? That would probably be in group vars for the Cisco group. And we look here and there is no creds. There's a variable named creds core underscore SSH and a variable named creds underscore napalm. So if I look at this failure 1 YAML and compare it to the fixed version, all I've changed is I've referred the credentials as core creds underscore core underscore SSH. We look at this. Here's our one that failed. Look at the one that is fixed. I see I have the exact same thing, but just a different provider. I go ahead and execute this. See if it works properly. Verify that we do have a working playbook. Go on to a second failure case. Okay, so I look at this. We have a simple playbook. We have some tasks. We have this iOS facts. We have provider. We have a tag here. Looks like we have the correct provider. Let's go ahead and execute this. See what the error message that we get. Now this one completely exited. So immediately gave an error message. And let's read the error message again. Error. No action detected in the task. This often indicates a misspelled module name. So it's saying it does not know the module you're referring to. So let's go back and look at our playbook. And this is an error I've made multiple times. If we look at our name, so here's our task section. Each entry inside the task section should be an Ansible task. But you see here, since I have a hyphen space, this is actually two separate tasks. The first task just has the name string, which is just a string it's going to print out, but it doesn't actually have a module with it. The next task doesn't have a name string, but it has this iOS fax. So we just have included an extra hyphen there. So if I do my diff again, we can see all I've done between the failure to and the failure to fixed is removed the extra hyphen. You can see there, I don't have that hyphen any longer. Go ahead and execute this. Verify that it works properly. Failure 3. Let's look at failure 3. Once again, simple playbook. Here's my top of my play. I get into the tasks section. Here's a task. Here we have things associated with that task. Name, iOS fax, tags. And then we have a second task, which is the debug module. Go ahead and execute this. Okay, once again, we immediately got an error. We look at where our error is pointing to us. It's saying, I don't like this section here. Test iOS, iOS fax, and it points at the iOS fax. And it's telling me there's a syntax problem. So we go back and we remember that spacing and indentation matters. So when we're doing tasks, the name string, the iOS fax, and the tags all need to be indented the same. So that needs to be indented at that level. Provider is an argument for iOS fax, so it should be indented inside iOS fax. So it didn't like, Ansible didn't like the fact that we had that extra space in that iOS fax line. And if I do a diff, I didn't save that, but if I do a diff here, you can basically see that I've removed that one space. Let's see if that runs properly. Which it does. So in this section, I've covered some high-level overview material about how to set up Ansible from a clean install, which included creating a virtual environment, configuring the .ansible.config file, also creating your inventory file. Remember in your inventory file to point to the Python that you're using in that virtual environment. Also remember that you might need to install into that new virtual environment some additional Python modules, some additional Python dependencies, depending on the libraries that you're using. We then talked about some high-level overview material of troubleshooting. So some of those items being read the error messages, try to simplify the problem. So if you have a longer playbook, try to simplify it to a more basic case. What were some of the other ones? Look for the section that it's talking about. Look for your indentation and spacing issues. You can, with the indentation and spacing issues, use some YAML linters, and they're online, and see if they help you. I haven't had great success with those helping me a lot, but you can try them and see if a YAML linter helps. But do remember that your spacing matters. Remember that your module path matters. Where is Ansible looking for modules? We then covered a few Ansible error conditions. In the next video, I'm going to go over a bunch more failure cases to try to give you some more examples of what failure and error messages look like.